Greetings, class. Welcome to Chapter 2. In this chapter, we're going to review the differences when it comes to the political economy amongst the nations. So this does raise the question, what is political economy? Especially when we talk about different countries. Essentially, when we bring up this term, it refers to a country's political, economic, and legal systems. These systems are interdependent and interact with one another and influence one another, thus understanding the state of a country's economic policies, their political theology, and their legal systems really become crucial for businesses as they decide to enter into a country or choose to exit a country. It has significant implications, particularly for international business, and thus we spend an entire chapter reviewing on a high level the different frameworks that are in play at various countries. So the political system uh, also refers to the system of government in a particular nation. Now, these systems can be assessed in terms of various degrees. Do they focus on a democratic approach or a totalitarian approach? Are they holding votes, or is it really controlled by a few select individuals within the government? Do they emphasize collectivism or individualism? Is the individual given more rights in some countries than others? Definitely yes. Is there a focus on collectivism for some countries over other countries? Also the answer is yes. Here's an interesting question you should pay attention to. If you ever presented with this question that states that the political economy is used to stress the fact that a nation's politics, their economic system, and their legal system are independent from one another, this would definitely be a false statement. As we stated earlier, they are interdependent. They influence one another. They don't act separate from one another, and thus understanding the entire ecosystem of a country when it comes to their politics, economic policy, and legal system is crucial for a business, particularly who wants to enter into that country. Let's talk about that two-part classification we identified earlier: collectivism versus individualism. Collectivism basically is a system that stresses the collective goal over the individual. This can be traced back to the philosopher Plato, essentially, as he argued a certain stratosphere to be implemented, society to be governed by the group of individuals and focusing on the greater good as a nation, if you will. Today, socialists support collectivism, essentially. When you emphasize collectivism, the needs of the society as a whole are generally viewed as being really more important than the individual freedoms of the citizens themselves. So let's talk a little bit more about socialism. It's got its roots essentially in Karl Marx and advocates that state ownership of the basic means of production, distribution, and exchange really should be had by the government. The state manages the enterprise for the benefit of the society as a whole. So, as we talked about, Plato did not equate collectivism with equality. This is true. Plato did not equate collectivism with equality. He believes that the society should be stratified into classes, with those best suited to rule in the society, administering the society for the benefit of the entire population, if you will. Particularly in the early 1920s, socialism split into communists and social democrats, essentially. Communists focused on collectivism, and they believed that it could only be achieved through revolution and totalitarian dictatorship, essentially. They were more aggressive, and they really focused on upheaving a society from the ground up. Social democrats work to achieve the same goal, but through democratic means, through the use of certain political systems that are already in play. Now, many state-owned enterprises fail to succeed. Today, many nations are implementing privatization programs, essentially. Let's talk about individualism then, the opposite side of this coin that we presented. It it espouses a philosophy that focuses on individuals, as you talked about, and really that the freedom of these individuals within the economic and political system should be pursued. It can be traced back to Aristotle, who argued that individual diversity and private ownership are essentially desirable. And again, it emphasizes individual freedoms and essentially self-expression. It lets people pursue their own interests to achieve the best overall good for a particular society and leverages the democratic system and free markets. Again, if you ever run into this question, I would probably say that it's a true statement. Karl Marx advocated state ownership of the basic means of production, distribution, and exchange. Probably an important question you should pay attention to. So let's talk about the differences between democracy and totalitarianism, essentially. When we talk about this, democracy focuses on a political system in which the government is governed by the people and essentially looks at the problem as a whole. Most common form of this today is representative democracy, where elected representatives vote on behalf of their members, if you will. Totalitarianism focuses on control of the government by particular parties and is absolute control in all spheres of human life, and opposing political parties are prohibited. It's definitely less focused on hearing the opinion of others and more focused on the opinion of one group of individuals or one individual specifically. So let's look at more of the attributes and the different regimes essentially. There's widespread political repression in totalitarianism. There are really no free or fair elections. Usually one party gains hold of the government and continues to maintain that hold. Media is censored, and basic civil rights are at times denied. Challenges to the regime is prohibited, and there really is a focus on control by this group. Now, if you've ever seen this question before or will see this question, you should probably think of this as a false statement, that social democrats believe that socialism could be achieved only through violent revolution and totalitarian dictatorship. This is actually the other side of that coin that we looked at earlier. Now, there are four major types of totalitarianism today, essentially. There's the communist construct, there's the theocratic construct, and there's the tribal construct, and finally the right-wing totalitarianism version. And each one has a different variation, essentially, where the communists focus on achieving their goals through totalitarian dictatorship, but is really focused on kind of a social dynamic to that. Theocratic totalitarianism focuses their emphasis on monopolizing control by a specific party or group of individuals, and really finds their roots in religious principles, if you will. Tribal totalitarianism focuses control by a specific tribe, and they monopolize that power because of their position, essentially. And the right-wing ones essentially focus on individual economic freedom being allowed, but individual political freedom is restricted in the belief that it could lead to communism, essentially. So, as we think about these different government structures and really change of power, it becomes more evident the selection of a leader and its impact from a global perspective. And we can see this transpire as President Obama won his election, and the whole world is watching, and there was many opinions as who the next president should be. I'm sure you've seen it in the news on a regular basis. Here's another interesting question for you to pay attention to. By the mid-1990s, communism was rising worldwide, essentially, and that could be nothing further from the truth. I would probably answer false to this statement because by the 1990s, communism was retreating worldwide. Now, let's talk about different versions of political ideology and economic systems that are essentially connected to one another. We can narrow it down to three types of economic systems: a market economy, a command economy, and essentially a mixed economy. Free market systems essentially look at the individual goals and give privacy over collectivism as a priority, if you will. State-owned enterprises restrict markets and are common in countries where collective goals are a dominant form of government. In a pure market economy, goods and services that a country produces and the quantities in which they produce is determined by supply and demand. It's basic economics 101. Consumers essentially purchase these goods. They determine the types of goods that are essentially created, the price that they're willing to pay. And the government's role is simply to encourage free trade and competition among private producers. It's very similar to what we see in the United States as a capitalistic society, essentially. Another important question you should probably pay attention to, that you should answer false to, is that one of the tenets of collectivism is that the welfare of the society is best served by letting people pursue their own economic interests. This is, again, nothing close to what it espouses, if you will. It focuses on the betterment of the society, and the individual's rights and freedoms are sacrificed for the betterment of the society. So in a pure command economy, the goods and services that a country produces and the quantities in which they produce these goods and the prices by which they sell these goods for are really planned by the government in a centralized fashion. All businesses are essentially state-owned, so they have little incentive to control costs and be effective, some would argue. And because of this, there's no private ownership. There's little incentive to better serve consumer needs because all of it is centrally focused, if you will. In a mixed economy, which includes elements of market economy and some elements of command economy, governments tend to take over troubled firms that are considered to be vital to the national interest, if you will. We can see this play out in the United States with the big automotive bailout, and also with the bailout of the banks that we witnessed in 2009, 2010, 2011, essentially. And there are a number of mixed economies in the world as we see them currently. Another question to pay attention to: in practice, in practical terms, individualism translates into advocacy of a democratic political system and market economies. This is a true statement. Individualism does focus on a kind of market economic approach where individuals articulate what they value through their purchasing habits, and the democratic political system is the system of preference, if you will. Now let's shift our focus to the legal system. And this really refers to a country's rules, essentially, or laws. And they focus on regulating behavior, which is really the process by which the law of a country is enforced and through which grievances are resolved and conflicts are essentially addressed. So we saw it today in Tom Brady's case. I'm from New England, from Boston, and Patriots fan. We saw that the judge ruled in favor of eliminating the 4-game suspension, if you will. So go Pats. Sorry, there's a little plug there. A country's legal system is really important, particularly laws, because they have direct application in regulating business practices, if you will. They define the manner in which a business transactions are executed. They also allow for the rights and obligations of those involved in that business transaction to be focused upon if any kind of infringement actually takes place. Now, there's really three different types of legal systems. There's essentially common law, which is based on tradition, precedent, and customs, essentially. Great examples can be found in Great Britain and the United States. Then there's civil law, which is based on detailed sets of rules, regulations, and codes, and can be found in 80 countries, such as Germany, France, Japan, and Russia. Then there's theocratic law, which is based upon religious teachings or theologies espoused by the ruling party, if you will. Islamic law is a perfect example of this. Here's another question that you should probably pay attention to. The answer is false to this one. In practical terms, collectivism creates a more favorable environment for international business to operate when compared to individualism. That's actually not necessarily the case, simply because with individualism, there's more motivation to build businesses, to essentially expand your organization because of competition, if you will. So let's consider the different types of law and really how common law and civil law differ, if you will. And they really focus on contractual law and their different approaches. But before we can even really talk about that, let's define contracts. They refer to the conditions in which exchange is to take place and really the details in terms of the rights and obligations of those parties involved. Thus, with this being kind of the groundwork in common law, contracts are very detailed with all contingencies spelled out, versus civil law states where contracts are shorter and much less specific. In our world, our contracts are very detailed. There are pages and pages. You can see any of them really when you even see you opting in for, say, an app to be installed on your phone or anything of that nature. Let's talk more about contractual disputes and which countries' laws should apply, essentially, because it does raise the question. Say Chrysler has an issue from a labor standpoint in India. Which laws will govern their decision-making process, essentially? And really, the United Nations has a great role in this capacity, if you will, the CIGS. They have established a uniform set of rules governing specific aspects of making and really the performance of everyday commercial contracts between sellers and buyers who have their place of business in different nations, if you will. And countries opt into the CIGS and signal that they're willing to comply with these common laws. Here's another question that you should pay attention to. If you've ever seen this question or will see this question, the answer is false, essentially because when we talk about a representative democracy, and particularly elected representatives who fail to perform their jobs, they can be voted out of office during the next election. So that's always a risk that they essentially run. Now let's talk about property rights and really the importance of property rights. Property rights refers to the legal right over the use of certain resources, and it's made upon say the income derived from these particular resources. Property rights can essentially be violated either by private action, if somebody steals something, either piracy or physically. There's blackmail that's involved, whether it's an individual or a group of individuals, these rights can be violated. Public action can also violate property rights to some degree, and particularly this is focused on public officials extorting income or resources from property holdings. This can take place through excessive tax, requiring expensive licenses, and really things of that nature. And really falls into kind of the category that we talked about in terms of the discussion question for this week, and that being corruption. It's really present in all countries in various degrees. Some countries are higher than others. Um, and is a concern for foreign direct investment. The more corrupt the country is, naturally there is a fall for that essentially. And also for international trade talks, economic growth. In your book, you'll see this chart regarding corruption in general as it relates to property rights, and regular surveys taken where they measure corruption by country. This data is actually from 2011, so it's several years old, but it really underlines the stress of organizations determining where should they expand. New Zealand, Finland, Japan, the United States have strong governments, and hence corruption is lower. Other countries such as Somalia and Russia, there's a bit of weakness there, hence corruption can take place. Now, when we talk about corruption, really Foreign Corruption Practice Act limits corruption in the United States because it really makes it illegal for foreign government officials to be bribed in order to maintain business over the foreign official and really to have authority over them. All publicly traded companies must keep detailed records so that it's clear whether or not they violated any particular laws, thanks to Sarbanes-Oxley and all the regulations that are present. There's a heavy enforcement in terms of regulation and documentation, if you will. Facilitating or expediting payments to secure the performance of routine government actions. Are permitted, so something to take into consideration. Intellectual property that is produced is a big deal nowadays, if you will, particularly because we're moving to a knowledge-based economy. And it really can include patents, it can include copyrights, and it can also include trademarks. And violations of these rights are important, particularly for generating revenue globally. So Microsoft Office can be heavily pirated in other countries where it should be sold. Also, music rights and things of that nature. So I remember when I went to the Philippines, and you could buy the latest movie right in the streets through a DVD. Very peculiar. So, I bought it and went home, stuck it in the DVD player, and hit play. Interestingly enough, it was a recorded movie session, meaning somebody actually went to the movie theaters and had their camera and recorded the whole thing, and they sold in the streets because of a lack of enforcement. They could essentially do that, and we can see that with different versions of Microsoft's product as well. So when it comes to protecting intellectual property, it becomes very important for countries to be able to do this. And there's different structures that have been put together. So the Paris Convention for the Protection of Individual Properties essentially is an agreement signed by 170 countries to protect intellectual property rights. There's also the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, which requires the WTO members to grant and enforce patents lasting at least 20 years and copyrights lasting at least 50 years. So there are attempts for regulation on an international level, which is a positive thing. So if you were ever to see this question, the answer is true, that being that totalitarian countries in general repress the individual rights of their citizens and essentially prevent them from freedom of expression and also access to free media and to hold regular elections and things of that nature. So with that being the case, let's go ahead and continue our lecture here. So let's talk about product safety and really liability. Product safety laws refer to a set of standards that are tied to safety, which essentially force companies to adhere to certain practices, if you will. When we talk about product liability, it involves a firm and its officers being held responsible when a product causes injury, death, or damage. Now, liability laws are unusually less extensive in some developed countries, so that's something to take into consideration. And firms really much decide to adhere to these standards of the home country or the host country. So what are the implications for managers then, particularly for the political economy of international business, and really whether or not they want to enter into a country and start their organization there or start business there? And they have to really take into consideration the political, economic, and legal systems of these countries. And it raises the important issues, perhaps revolving around ethics and the implications of practicing in these countries. In some countries, bribery is almost necessary in order to grow your business. It's simply common practice, if you will. I know the Philippines, that's where I've come from. It's common practice. That might have changed now, but when I was still there, it was an unfortunate practice that was in play. We're talking about the political, economic, and legal environment of a country. And there are clearly influences that are more attractive for some countries and less, particularly for investment. So it really raises the question, where should you do business? And it forces organizations to look at these different elements and make their best decision. And things change in a radical way, if you will. So it's something to take into consideration and really manage as a business manager looking to grow on a global scale.